On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to take a look at the nation of Russia. Perestroika and Glasnost have been utter failures. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me Russia 2000.
J.R., Russia is a master of deception. This statement has come from several quarters. Russia has a history of doing battle by building false facades, directing your attention over here, while meanwhile over here something else is going on. And that has very much happened in the last few years in the modern Soviet Union, or as it is called these days, the RF, the Russian Federation.
One of the interesting things about Russia is that it is named in the Bible. It is one of the few modern nations named in the Bible, and God says, I am against thee. We're going to try to pick this apart today, Gary, and analyze it and see why God is against Russia. We begin with Ezekiel chapter 38. Son of man, set thy face against Gog in the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. These are two ancient words for Moscow and Tobolsk, two of the main capitals of Russia, and prophesy against him. And then he goes on to describe how in the latter days they're going to come against Israel, and a great war will ensue. And as a result of this war, Gary, and the destruction of Russia, the Jews are going to be burning the weapons for 7 years.
And J.R., many people, and you're referring, of course, to Ezekiel 39:9, where the weapons following this great war will be gathered up and burned with fire for 7 years. Many people have said that this poses a very interesting problem when you're attempting to set up a timeline for the invasion. Some people have said, well, if Israel is looting the defeated Gog for 7 years and spoiling them and burning their weapons, then this must mean that this can't be during the time of the Great Tribulation, or would have to be in the time of the Great Tribulation and not in the millennial reign of Christ, or some say would have to even be earlier, maybe before the tribulation, in order to take care of all this burning before the Lord comes and sets everything right again. So a lot of people establish this invasion as very, very early on, perhaps even pre-tribulational.
Well, Gary, I see these 7 years as typical of the 7 years of tribulation. And so I think the Battle of Gog and Magog will be pre-tribulation, or somewhere near the beginning of the tribulation period. Let's find out what's happening in Russia today. Back in the early 1980s, the KGB came to the Kremlin hierarchy and said to Gorbachev, Andropov, and others, I guess, who eventually oversaw this dismantling of the Soviet system, that they were not going to win over the United States. They were going to lose the battle because they did not have a Silicon Valley, they did not have a technology and an economy like the United States. It was purely money, it seemed to me, that caused them to realize that the ruble would never be better than the dollar.
Absolutely. And what has happened in the interim is that our State Department has adopted a policy, and that policy, J.R., has involved appeasement, for want of a better term. In the name of cooperation, we have channeled money through the International Monetary Fund and various loan agreements into Russia. And
continue to do so.
Continue to do so to this very day. And those funds have been channeled in the interest of international peace. Supposedly, if you give your brother nation a hand up, then the brother will join you in peaceful cooperation on a global scale. Hasn't worked. As a matter of fact, J.R. is about to read from a recent news report exactly why it hasn't worked.
I got this off the internet, talking about the economy. After years of decline, Russia's flirtation with capitalism has now reached a critical juncture. The experiment with Western-style capitalism has collapsed, and the invention of Russia's peculiar and wild brand of capitalism has ended in outrageous scandal and popular discontent. A decade worth of foreign aid and investment has left Russia a pauper nation. With so much money flowing into the former Soviet Union, what has happened to it? Where has it gone? Well, according to this report, it has been siphoned off by the KGB or KGB agents who positioned themselves back over the past decade or so to become a part of every economic stride, the development of foreign capital coming into the country. They had to have a Russian partner. Mm-hmm. And who was that Russian partner? A KGB agent who siphoned off the profits and sent them to their Swiss bank accounts, leaving the nation in shambles. And this has been widespread. Listen to this statement. Productivity is half of what it was a decade ago. Real disposable incomes have also fallen by half. Up to $500 billion in capital has fled for havens abroad. Foreign investors are expected to pump this year only $1 billion into the economy by the end of this year, down from the $2.2 billion last year. And Gary, this seems to be the rule of thumb, that Russia is, according to this report, Russia is weak, Russia's economy is falling apart because of the thieves. Now, about 50% of the economy is controlled by the KGB. Another 40%, they say, is controlled by the mafia, the Russian mafia, and that leaves the people with making an average of $31 a month, $1 a day salary.
And I've heard the opinion expressed that the Russian mafia may be just a straw man, that perhaps the KGB has infiltrated even that group, thereby putting a complete tight grip of control on the entire Russian Federation.
Two sides of the same coin.
Two sides of the same coin, exactly. We have seen Russian military spending dramatically increase in the last few months with new weaponry and with the invasion of Chechnya in the Caucasus. That's in the southernmost part of Russia. That's the part of Russia that's closest to Israel. You have the Caucasus Mountains, and just behind those mountains, Russia seems to be pre-positioning large numbers of troops and materials that could be airlifted very quickly to the south. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of smoke screens. For example, the Russian Federation Defense Minister Igor Sergeyev on November 12th, 1999, accused the United States of stirring up the war in Chechnya as a plot to weaken the Russian superpower. And he said that U.S. interests are fanning the flames in Chechnya and making this whole thing bigger than it should be. It's total fabrication. This is not true at all. What has happened in Russia is that over the past 4 to 5 months, according to several sources, Russian military spending has increased 1.5 times. Colonel Stanislav Lunev, a Russian defector, has written this about the Soviet economy or the Russian Federation economy. He says the money is coming from America and other Western countries, or more precisely, it comes chiefly out of the pockets of American taxpayers, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other financial institutions which heavily depend on American money. They have funneled tens of billions into Russia's corrupted economy. Some of these billions have vanished only to have magically reappeared in the private accounts of so-called new Russians in the Western banks. There's a very important statement that comes next, but some of it also has been diverted into improving the Russian military-industrial complex. And we're talking about billions. For example, the Nunn-Lugar Senate bill, called the Cooperative Threat Reduction Act, has moved $1.7 billion into the Russian Federation recently, J.R., all in the interest of cooperation.
That's amazing. In a few moments, we're going to tell you about some of the new nuclear technologies, new missiles, the Topol and others that Russia has, and what it means for the United States and for the West. And we're going to talk about how the KGB has permeated the entire economy of the Soviet Union. So don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment. When the old Soviet Union fell apart, what the West did not understand is that the old politicians stayed in power. According to this article on the internet, the West's initial elation at the collapse of the Soviet Union ignored the fact that the old regime's politicians, bureaucracy, and attitudes remain intact. Intact alongside them in the late 1980s and early 1990s was the Russia's history of centralized control. Russia's new economy is rested on the same institutions as the old. No wonder it was doomed to failure. The Soviet legal system remained in place, as did its socio-economic structures. Gary, over the years, there have been, for example, 1989 to 1991, the KGB funneled at least 60 metric tons of gold, 150 metric tons of silver, 8 metric tons of platinum, and from $15 to $50 billion in hard currency abroad, according to Russian investigators. And so a lot of the money that is funneled in has just been siphoned off to Swiss bank accounts and to other foreign investments.
It's fascinating that the theoreticians of global communism are great capitalists. They know the value of investment. They ship that money off into the West, and they make money.
But I thought the communist was supposed to be a man who's for the little people.
This is one of the great lies of all time. Their leaders line their own pockets. They've been doing it ever since 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution. The leaders of the Communist Revolution became the new class. They became the new upper class with their dachas, their mansions, their Black Sea resorts, and their Mediterranean villas, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lie, JR. And the big lie is in military development. Russia has pretended to be dismantling its military machine. And yet, Nikolai Mikhailov, the Russian defense minister, has a plan. The Russian General Staff has a 10-year military development plan, and they're saying that by 2010 they will have the world's top military machine, complete with every kind of offensive and defensive missile. For example, they've just launched the 5th generation Borei-class ballistic missile submarine, and inside that submarine is a new submarine-based ballistic missile. They've launched the Akula II class nuclear attack submarine called the Shark. They have the new Sverdlovsk class nuclear attack submarine, and from my perspective, JR, the most threatening of all of their new military developments is the Topol-M, intercontinental ballistic missile with new stealth concepts built into it. We do not possess anything like the Topol. It has a 6,000-mile range with deadly accuracy, and the interesting thing about it is it's totally mobile. It can be moved on trains. It can be moved on mobile launch platforms at very high rates of speed, and set up and launched in practically no time at all. And it's impossible to detect even during the launching because it has been it incorporates new stealth design features. I don't know what they are, but I've read that it has them.
And I can understand why the Lord would say, I'm against the Ogog, because they would, their goal is misdirected. Their final goal is to destroy the world.
Yes.
They are building the implements by which to destroy the world. But you know, there's another little interesting tidbit in the last chapters of the book of Revelation, where at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Jesus as King of Kings and Lord of Lords over what I would call utopia, the devil is loose for a little season, and he goes out to deceive the nations, and lo and behold, where does he go? Gog and Magog.
Yes.
I mean, this is really ludicrous, don't you think?
It
After
is.
1,000 years?
J.R., it shows that this particular piece of real estate has a deadly, a dark side to it. And we read in Ezekiel 38 and 39 about this battle launched against Israel, and we've read it so many times, it's very obvious that it's a latter-day event. It says so. And it talks about Israel having been gathered out of the nations and living in peace in unwalled villages. But J.R., there's this nagging little phrase in here in Ezekiel 38:13. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all the young lions thereof shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? J.R., Russia in the Caucasus, pre-positioning troops, materials, and so forth, is as close to Israel as possible to get without leaving their own country.
Yes.
Now, if they were to launch a battle, they would have to go through Persia, they would have to go through Syria, they'd have to go through parts of Iraq, and on their left flank, over in Saudi Arabia, would be the massive military emplacements of the oil-producing nations, courtesy of the United States of America and Great Britain. There it is. Sheba, Dedan, merchants of Tarshish. And they would have to defeat that machine in order to successfully take Israel. In other words, we're talking about an attack to the south that's sort of a two-pronged attack, one headed toward Israel, one headed toward Saudi Arabia. And the Bible seems rather clear about this.
And it's interesting, Gary, that you said that Russia was building its military machinery in Chechnya.
Yes.
Chechnya is located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, right at the northern neck border, the panhandle, I guess we should say, of Iran. And that's just about as far south as you can get.
It is.
And so Russia is moving all of her troops and military there. What a perfect staging area for Gog and Magog's war Ezekiel was talking about here.
It is the perfect staging area. It's high ground, but it's behind mountains, the Caucasus Mountains, so that things could be hidden until the last minute. J.R., we have in Ezekiel 38:4 a statement that's caused much discussion. God is speaking to Gog, and God says, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army and horses and horsemen, etc. Now, many have wondered, what is the hook in the jaw that could draw Gog down? We've heard maybe they're coming after oil, a lot of oil in the Middle East. Maybe they're coming after the mineral riches of the Dead Sea. Maybe they're just coming down to establish warm water seaports, for this has been a long dream of the Soviet Union. But maybe it's something much more powerful than that.
I think it's Israel's nuclear power. You see, Israel is going to use their power against Syria. Gary, right now, according to many of the news sources out of Israel, such as the Jerusalem Post and the Jewish Voice, there are stories about Israel's talking to Syria over the Golan Heights, and yes, Syria says, we won't talk to you until you give us back the Golan Heights. These negotiations are going to fail, are they not?
They are, and we have here in the November 1999 Jewish Voice and Opinion a long article about the failure of Israel to negotiate seriously with Syria. Unless Ehud Barak agrees in advance, they say, to withdraw to the June 4th, 1967 line, Syria is saying no deal of any kind. Don't even come and talk to us. J.R., again, in the language of the people where we grow up, them's fighting words.
According to Isaiah chapter 17, Damascus is taken away from being a city. It shall be a ruinous heap. Immediately following that, in verse 12, it says, woe to the multitude of many people which make a noise like the noise of the seas, that is a roaring type sound, and to the rushing of nations that make a rushing like the rushing of mighty waters. The nations shall rush like the rushing of many waters, but God shall rebuke them, and they shall flee far off, and shall be chased as the chaff of the mountains. Could that be the Caucasus?
Yeah, you know, it could well be. This hook in Gog's jaw, J.R., the one thing that could bring Gog down with a vengeance is if Israel, out of desperation, broke out one nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
That would torch the whole Middle East.
Destroy the city of Damascus.
Destroy the city of Damascus, and Russia would be there overnight. And you know, as you were reading from Isaiah, Isaiah must have seen and heard this in a vision. And he wrote about what he saw and he heard. Have you ever heard a massed airlift? I was at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, once during a mock military invasion. And there were probably 100 airplanes in the air dropping paratroopers and supplies. And JR, there's only one sound that sounds like that, and that's the rushing of many waters.
Yeah.
Isaiah must have heard something like that.
He must have. The interesting thing about this is Damascus is one of the oldest cities in the world.
Yes.
Still exists today. It was mentioned right here in Isaiah. It is a city that dates back 2,500 plus years. And yet, there's coming a day. And by the way, Damascus has never been destroyed before.
That's right.
In history. Check it out. Last 2,700 years has not been destroyed. It will be, Damascus will be a ruinous heap, said Isaiah, which will cause a great multitude of people to come, the rushing of many nations against the mountains of Israel, and God alone will win the victory. We'll be back in just a moment. We mentioned the Russian mafia a little while ago. Gary suggested that we could just write the word KGB in there. In other words, Russia is in the grip of wicked people.
Absolutely, JR, and has no tradition of godly leadership whatsoever to stand in their way of doing their wicked worst. JR read from Isaiah 17, the concluding verse of Isaiah 17, the 14th verse. It says, "And behold, at eventide, trouble, and before the morning, he is not." That is, he is destroyed, basically, is what it says in the Hebrew. This is the
quick battle.
Quick battle. It's amazing, JR, when you stop and think about modern warfare. Modern warfare has developed a capability using night vision goggles, side-looking radar, infrared forward-looking scopes, which are on the panels of airplanes. They can navigate in the dark of the moon, total darkness, and move right in on a target and not be seen until the very last second. And that's what seems to be described here by Isaiah.
But Israel's waiting and ready for them.
Yes.
And when they come, they're going to be in for a real surprise. Let me ask you a question. Do you know Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? Because you see, He's the only one who's going to win. All of these people we're talking about here, they're going to lose. Jesus alone will win. He alone can give you eternal life. We encourage you to trust Him. He's the only one you can trust. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.